Filmmaker Janek Ambros and Academy Award nominee James Cromwell recently completed the documentary Imminent Threat. It's about the war on terror's impact on civil liberties and this sort of interesting coalition that it could create between the progressive left and the libertarian right on these specific issues. I'm joined by Janek Ambros now. Janek, it's so interesting. You know, we've talked about these libertarian right and progressive left coalitions that can sometimes develop. One area where this can happen is around the war on drugs and the imprisonment of nonviolent drug offenders. And another area that we see it is with regard to surveillance and the fighting of the war on terror, etc. Talk to us a little bit about your background. How is this a topic broadly that you first got pulled into?
Well, I came from that kind of 2008. I was in college in 2008, and when Ron Paul was coming up, and I was a little new into politics, so it was just really interesting to kind of he had unique ideas, I guess I would say. So while I'm definitely wouldn't prescribe myself as libertarian now, when I was in college, I did find a lot of what Ron Paul was saying was amusing.
And that's interesting because it's very common that I talk to people who, particularly when they weren't that politically engaged, they heard Ron Paul, his delivery, his demeanor, it sounds so different, it sounds unique, and people sometimes get pulled into the sort of tone rather than the substance of some of the messages.
Right, and what would happen is as I gradually got more into politics, when I was younger, I had a few other films I made, and they played at a Freedom Fest, which is a libertarian conference. So I made a lot of great friends in the whole libertarian crowd, and I'm still friends with them till today. So I think that gave me a unique perspective to kind of totally put aside economic policy and just focus on stuff we agree on. Because a lot of the times you do have this big hostility between the progressives and libertarians, not just in terms of economic policy, but even just the overall demeanor. Like sometimes you do see a lot of hostility. So it was easy for me to kind of totally separate, totally omit any conversation of healthcare, essentially everything other than specific issues on civil liberties, which I think really did help. Like no one, if you were to see the movie, you wouldn't really know where this person stands on that issue, at least.
Yeah, and we recently interviewed a former NRA official who is part of a group that is conservatives concerned about the death penalty or something like that. And when talking about the death penalty, I, as a progressive liberal, and this former NRA official basically agree on 99.9% of the reasoning and tone and ideology around why we shouldn't have the death penalty. I don't know that there would be any other issue on which we would be able to have a conversation like that. And sometimes that's sort of required, right? You have to, on important issues, you partner with those that have the same sort of interest in moving forward on that issue, and you kind of put other issues aside, as the case may be.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think one good example was the Amash Amendment, and I think that was part of one of the defense budgets. It was an amendment that would defund was funding Section 215 of the Patriot Act, and I believe that was a few years ago, and it was pretty much just a dead split between liberals and conservatives on the issue. So that was a good indication that there's room to grow from there, and I think it goes also into foreign policy as well, in terms of foreign entanglements and foreign adventurism. So there is a lot of room to grow there. And when I talked to Ahalan Arulanantham, he's a deputy legal director at the ACLU, he talked about how just on a local level it helps a lot more. I mean, and I think it's a little bit more difficult on a national scale because there's just so many more kind of factors involved with media, with party loyalty. We're in local municipal kind of ways. It's a little bit easier, I think.
Yeah, and also in some municipalities, the candidates do not run as Republicans or Democrats. They're sort of nonpartisan elections where you just have to hear the people out and figure out on what side of the political spectrum they are. Let me remind everybody, we're talking about the documentary film Imminent Threat. I want to talk a little bit with you about the approach that you take in the film. I know that in the film you very clearly explain how 9/11 was used as a pretext to get people on board with passing all sorts of surveillance, Patriot Act, NSA surveillance, etc., under the guise of keeping us safe, etc. I'm curious whether you also take the approach of sort of talking about whether this type of surveillance works. Because what I find is that there are some people whose view on surveillance, be it positive or negative, is based on a legal argument, right? Are our civil liberties being violated? Are we seeing a deterioration of the expectation of privacy? But then there's others who are more influenced by the effectiveness or really the lack of effectiveness of a lot of these programs. So talk about that a little bit.
Well, I think it's even just aside from domestic surveillance. I think the entire film we really tried to, approach it as for kind of the second thing you said is really approach and saying, is this legal? That's why if we first, start the film, we pretty much we mentioned we said, well, look, a lot of these great presidents, which is ironic because you have a lot of these, freedom lovers always talking about the founding fathers. The Alien Sedition Act was was far from maybe something that they would think would agree with. But the point being is that it was the focus is really about the legalities. So the effect, whether or not it's effective, is almost, I don't want to say irrelevant. Of course, that might be the best term. But a great example is the AUMF, right? So one area we talked a little bit about was the 2001 AUMF, the authorization to use military force after 9/11, which I think only one senator voted no. It was Barbara Lee of California.
And ultimately allowed President Bush to make the decision to go into Iraq.
Yeah, so we believe that was the 2002 AUMF. But the 2001 was...
I'm sorry, you're right. Yeah, you're right.
Yeah. The 2001 AUMF was basically to go essentially a blank check to fight terrorism. So, like, what we talk about in the documentary is saying, well, that should be repealed because it's constitutionally illegal. And then if we would decide to go to a country, we would have to then eventually make a new AUMF. So it's almost like, obviously, I think the tone of the documentary is very pro-civil liberties. And, I guess I would say, I hate sometimes using the word anti-war, but anti-war, I'm not going to deny that. But in context-wise, content-wise, it's mostly just saying, this is illegal. And it's just almost as simple as just pointing that out.
Yeah, and I don't disagree with you that that's a very strong argument to make, but I would still, in my mind, if you can convince someone to oppose these policies in spite of them being illegal because they're not effective, that's still someone who's now on your side. So while I agree with you that the legal case is either it's legal or it's not, and if it's not, we shouldn't have it. If mobilizing people against these policies comes as a result of just explaining to them that they're often not effective, I still would see that as a win.
No, I totally agree, and I think you're right. I mean, Jeremy Scahill talks a lot about that. I think he's with The Intercept now, obviously with Greenwald and Laura Poitras and all those guys. But yeah, he talks a lot about how it's just ineffective because essentially you have now you just have a more massive haystack to find the needle by collecting the mass surveillance data. I think there's going to be more work on that. I honestly think there's going to be a lot more precise and maybe new investigative journalism into the effectiveness because you're absolutely right. I mean, that's a very easy way to influence someone if you actually can have systemic just proof, evidence that it's saying, well, this isn't working because X, Y, and Z. Then it's going to be much easier to maybe get somebody to go on somebody's side of liberties from somebody who's a little bit more hawkish. So I think that makes sense. But you never know because you have the Pentagon and a lot of people saying a lot of things. There's a lot of people saying that drones can create more terrorism, but it's hard to influence people that, or even they talk about global warming. The Pentagon talks about how global warming is an imminent threat. And that doesn't seem to dissuade a lot of people. So you never know, I guess. But I think of course, it wouldn't hurt to have more research done on how effective it is, and I think that's being done.
Where can people see the film?
So the film right now is exclusively on Amazon Instant, so you can rent it there. I think it's $4 to rent. And then you can also follow us on Twitter, and that's Imminent Threat 1. And so we'll just kind of be giving updates, and any kind of screenings that might be locally. But yeah, that's nationwide. You can see it on Amazon.
All right, we've been speaking to filmmaker Janek Ambros, who, along with Academy Award nominee James Cromwell, recently completed the documentary Imminent Threat. Thanks so much for talking to us about the film.